Welcome, traveler. Not to a tale of living, but to the art of leaving. This isn't your typical history lesson. Tonight, we're taking a one-way walk into the most dramatic exits ever etched into human memory. Not with sorrow, but with awe, irony, dark laughter, and stunned disbelief. Some people are remembered for how they lived. These people, they're remembered for how they died. You might think death is final, that it's quiet, that it happens off-screen, respectfully. But history disagrees, because some people don't simply pass away. They plunge into legend, kicking and screaming, laughing and bleeding, outsmarting fate, or being sucker-punched by it. This is a journey through the most epic deaths in history, not just because they were strange or poetic or gruesome, but because they revealed more in those final moments than their entire lives did. These are the stories that make you say, that can't be real. But they are, at least, real enough to survive centuries. Some of these people tried to cheat death and failed in spectacular fashion. Others walked straight toward it with a grin and a line so good it still echoes. Many didn't see it coming, and when it came, it was weird, ironic, or devastatingly funny. So, before we start, take a breath. Dim the lights if you like. Get comfortable. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Picture a shadowy tavern, flickering torchlight, and an old storyteller leaning in, whispering, "You won't believe how this one ends." Now, a word of warning. These aren't sanitized deaths. They're raw, real, ridiculous. They include a philosopher who laughed himself to death, a king who became his enemy's footstool, a tailor who trusted his own parachute and lost, a warlord who died because of a beheaded man's tooth, and an emperor whose final act was being stuffed and displayed. They're funny. They're tragic. Sometimes both. But what binds them all is this. These people didn't just leave the world. They made an entrance on the way out. And while we often romanticize life, its purpose, its triumphs, death tends to be boxed up, hidden away, turned into something clinical or polite. But not here. Not tonight. Tonight, we open that box, and instead of whispers, we find roars. Final acts more theatrical than anything on Broadway. Deaths that feel like screenplays written by fate itself, where timing, irony, and symbolism collide like flaming chariots. Take the king who spent his life building immunity to poison, only to be forced to die by the sword because the poison no longer worked. Or the philosopher so amused by a donkey eating figs and wine, he laughed himself into the afterlife. Or the mystic monk Rasputin, who survived poison, bullets, and beatings, only to finally die beneath the ice, still fighting. But this isn't a glorification of death. It's a celebration of absurdity, of fate's strange sense of humor, of how people face the end, with dignity, foolishness, pride, or pure accident. Because when all is said and done, we're not just defined by how we live. We're also defined by how we go out. And for these unforgettable figures, death wasn't the curtain fall. It was the encore, the part that made the crowd rise to their feet, the moment that made people say, "That's how legends die." There's something human in that, a longing to be remembered, to not slip quietly into the shadows, but to burn, blaze, crash, or collapse in a way that leaves a crater in memory. These stories aren't here to comfort you. They're here to make you grin, shake your head, and realize that sometimes history doesn't just teach us dates and wars. Sometimes it slaps us in the face and says, "Look at this madness, this actually happened." So before we begin, I ask you, are you ready to meet the man who tried to outwit poison, only to find he'd outwitted his own death? To meet a Viking, who won the battle, but was killed by a tooth? To hear how a general was felled by a roof tile, a king by a dessert, and a genius mathematician by a soldier who just hated circles? Are you ready to hear of emperors who were turned into furniture, of rebels who became myth, and of queens whose silence roared louder than any throne? This is not a history of peace. It's a history of exits. Strange, brutal, glorious, and unforgettable. Let's begin. In the annals of ancient royalty, no one played the long game with death quite like Mithridates VI, king of Pontus, master, linguist, lover of toxins, and the world's first walking science experiment. Born in the 2nd century BCE, Mithridates didn't just inherit a throne, he inherited paranoia. His own father was poisoned. Assassination wasn't a threat. It was expected. For a monarch in the ancient world, ruling was like sleeping on a bed of daggers, some of which were already coated in something fatal. But Mithridates wasn't about to wait for fate to sneak up on him. No, he decided to train against it. Rather than fear poison, he made it breakfast. Day by day, drop by drop, he consumed small doses of every deadly substance known to man. Hemlock, belladonna, cyanide, arsenic, snake venom. If it could kill a man, Mithridates took it like a vitamin. The result? A body forged in chemical fire. A man who turned his bloodstream into a graveyard for poisons. Over time, his tolerance became legendary. His personal apothecaries even brewed a mystical concoction called Mithridatium, an antidote so potent that medieval doctors were still trying to replicate it 1,000 years later. Where others saw food, he saw threats. Where others sipped wine, he tasted for murder. But paranoia has a price. Mithridates grew more and more isolated, suspicious of everyone, even his own family. His court was a web of secrets, his meals a laboratory. He trusted no one because death was always coming, and he meant to meet it on his terms. Unfortunately, Rome had other ideas. To the Romans, Mithridates wasn't a marvel. He was an obstacle, an Eastern king getting too big, too bold, too independent. So they came, not with poison, but with swords. 3 brutal wars erupted between Pontus and Rome, stretching over decades. Mithridates lost. Then he won. Then lost again. His allies betrayed him, his children turned on him, and his once great kingdom crumbled under the relentless Roman boot. Finally, cornered in the Black Sea region, exiled and surrounded by enemies and mutinous forces, Mithridates saw the writing on the wall. The Romans would capture him, parade him through the streets of Rome in chains, strip him of dignity, turn his life into a circus. Not a chance. This was the moment he'd spent years preparing for. He reached for his last dose, his final poison, the one he had saved for this moment, his loyal companion, the quiet killer, and nothing happened. He waited and waited. The poison didn't work. His hands trembled, not from death but from the bitter irony. He had made himself so immune to death's subtle hand that he couldn't die when he needed to. The final act of his great plan, the poetic exit, the silent dignity, it was all ruined by his own invincibility. Imagine it. A king, hunched over, betrayed, broken, desperate to die, but trapped by the very strength he'd built. The poison that once terrified him now refused to answer his call. What was left? He turned to one of his most trusted guards, a Gallic mercenary, and in what may have been his last bitter joke, Mithridates ordered the man to do it the old-fashioned way. Plan B, he might have muttered. Use the sword. And so the king who had outsmarted poison, who had beaten back death for decades with chemistry and obsession, was finally undone by cold steel. No antidotes, no elegance, just a blade, sharp and simple. Mithridates' death is a tragedy written by irony itself. The man who feared poison more than war, who spent his life building a fortress inside his body, was killed by the one thing he hadn't prepared for, a stab in the gut. What's more poetic or cruel than that? He became a legend, not just for his wars or his science, but for how completely he foiled his own escape plan. His body may have resisted 1,000 deaths, but in the end, it couldn't dodge the simplest one. His name would live on not as a great conqueror, but as a cautionary tale. The man who made himself invincible and found himself trapped inside his own survival. There's a strange kind of poetry in that, because for all his brilliance, his calculation, his laboratory of self-improvement, Mithridates forgot one truth. Death doesn't follow formulas. It doesn't care for antidotes. It waits. And when it wants you, it doesn't knock. It kicks the door down. If you're searching for a death that feels like a punchline written by the gods themselves, look no further than Sigurd Eysteinsson, better known as Sigurd the Mighty, a Viking earl who conquered islands, crushed rivals, and then got killed by a dead man's tooth. Yes, you read that right. This isn't a metaphor. This is the story of a brutal Norse warrior who did everything right in battle, except check the dental hazards of his enemy's severed head. Let's rewind. We're in the 9th century, a time when Norsemen ruled by the axe and the sea, and your reputation lived or died with how loudly your enemies cursed your name. Sigurd ruled over the Orkney Islands, a jagged outcrop north of Scotland, cold and ruthless as the sea that surrounded them. He wasn't just an earl. He was a storm in human form. Fierce in battle, feared by neighboring chieftains, and not one to accept even the slightest challenge to his pride. He was ambitious, brash, and loved a good fight, especially when it guaranteed his name would be carved into the bones of history. Enter his rival, a Scottish noble named Bright, the Buck-Toothed. No, really. That was his name. It sounds like a tavern insult, but it was probably said with respect, or at least fear. His front teeth were so famously large that people remembered them centuries later. And yes, this unfortunate dental feature is about to matter a lot. Sigurd and Bright had beef. Old-fashioned, bloody Viking-style beef. The kind that didn't end in words but in war. Eventually, Sigurd challenged Bright to battle. The deal was simple. 40 men each, a fair fight, except Sigurd didn't do fair. He showed up with 80 men. When the dust settled, Sigurd's side had obliterated the Scots. It was a massacre. Sigurd personally beheaded Bright, proving his dominance in the only way that mattered back then, by holding his enemy's head high. But Sigurd wasn't content with just winning. He wanted to show off. So he tied Bright's severed head to his saddle, not just as a trophy, but as a companion on his victory ride home. Now we can imagine Sigurd galloping across the wind-whipped highlands, feeling like a war god, with his enemy's head bouncing at his side, the blood long since dried, the skull swinging like a pendulum of glory. And then fate, the grinning trickster that it is, decided to get involved. As the horse rode and the head bounced, one of Briti's famously large front teeth scraped across Sigurd's calf. Just a scratch, a little skin torn open, nothing a hardened Viking would even notice. Except this was the 9th century. No penicillin, no antiseptic, no bandages, really. A scrape wasn't just a scrape. It was an invitation. Within days, the wound got infected. The infection spread, fever followed, and then death. Sigurd the Mighty, slayer of men, ruler of the Orkneys, conqueror of the North, was killed by a tooth. Let that sink in. He won the battle. He cheated. He crushed his rival. But the corpse had one last bite in him. The irony is Shakespearean. The brutality is Viking. And the result? A death so ridiculous, so unexpected, that it defies belief. And yet it sits comfortably in the historical record. It reads like a myth, but it's real enough that scribes saw fit to write it down. Maybe because they saw in it the same lesson we do now. Pride rides fast, but irony rides faster. Sigurd died not with a sword in his gut or a spear in his chest, but from the infected scratch of a man whose head he'd already removed. It was as if the gods looked down and said, "Okay, you win, but you don't get to enjoy it." There's something hilariously poetic about it. A warning disguised as a joke, because Sigurd didn't just defeat his enemy. He took him along for the ride, and in doing so, sealed his own fate. The lesson? Maybe don't gloat. Maybe don't. Tie your enemy's head to your horse, and definitely don't underestimate the dead guy's teeth. History has plenty of dramatic Viking deaths, men burning on ships, pierced with arrows, or falling heroically in battle. But none are quite so ridiculously legendary as this. Sigurd didn't fall in combat. He wasn't betrayed by allies. He was betrayed by his own ego and a well-timed molar. So raise a horn, if you will, to Sigurd the Mighty, a man who conquered with violence and was conquered in the end by dental revenge. Some men are born to win battles. Fewer are cursed to win them so spectacularly badly that they lose everything in the process. Enter Pyrrhus of Epirus, a name that gave us the phrase Pyrrhic victory, which roughly translates to, "Congratulations, you won, but at what cost?" Pyrrhus was no minor warlord. He was a cousin to Alexander the Great, a tactician of terrifying brilliance, and a general whose battlefield instincts were so sharp they nearly cut his own empire in half. In his prime, Pyrrhus could go toe-to-toe with Rome itself. His armies were disciplined, his elephants were terrifying, and his ambition was boundless. He didn't just want to win wars, he wanted to carve his name into the bones of history like his legendary cousin had. But ambition, like war elephants, is hard to steer. Over the years, Pyrrhus fought campaign after campaign, trying to keep hold of his fragmented kingdom. And every time he won, the cost was staggering. Thousands dead, allies gone, morale shattered. He began collecting victories like a gambler collects debts, impressive to outsiders, but terrifying to the people paying the price. And eventually, Pyrrhus found himself far from home, chasing yet another political opportunity, this time in the Greek city of Argos. Why? Because when you're a war-addicted monarch with something to prove, every city starts looking like a throne that just needs conquering. But this wasn't a grand siege or a noble last stand. No, this was a mess. It was late. His troops were tired. The city was asleep. But Pyrrhus didn't believe in waiting for sunrise, so under cover of night he launched an assault, and from the start, everything went wrong. His war elephants, yes, he had them, got stuck in Argos's narrow streets, unable to maneuver. His troops got confused, scattered in alleys. Communication broke down. What was meant to be a lightning strike turned into a midnight comedy. Picture it, one of history's greatest generals, bumping into walls, shouting orders no one could hear, fighting street to street like a tourist who took a wrong turn and ended up in a riot. And then, fate stepped in, from above. On one of the rooftops above the chaos, an elderly woman watched it all unfold. She had no sword, no armor, no horse, just a roof tile and a hell of an arm. Now we don't know her name. We don't know what motivated her. Maybe she hated war. Maybe she lost someone to Pyrrhus. Or maybe she just got sick of loud men yelling in the street at 2 a.m. Whatever it was, she acted. With the calm precision of someone who'd thrown a few things before, at chickens, grandchildren, or maybe other generals, she picked up a roof tile, leaned over the edge, and let it fly. Direct hit. The ceramic slab slammed into Pyrrhus's head with the full fury of divine timing. The king, conqueror of nations, slayer of Romans, nightmare of empires, collapsed like a sack of laundry. Disoriented, concussed, and bleeding in the dirt. Moments later, an enemy soldier, possibly confused, possibly just seizing the chance, rushed over and finished the job. And just like that, the man who had survived the deadliest battles in the ancient world, who had stood toe-to-toe with the might of Rome and lived to tell about it, was taken out by bad architecture and a grandma's judgment. There was no glory, no epic last duel, no monologue about duty or legacy. Just a roof tile, gravity, and one good throw. It's almost beautiful in a brutal way. Because Pyrrhus, like so many powerful men, believed himself untouchable. He charged into cities, woke sleeping armies, gambled soldiers' lives on ambition. But in the end, his death wasn't decided by tactics or treachery. It was decided by an old woman with timing and tile work. There's no statue to her. No gold-engraved name. History barely remembers her existence. But that tile, that throw, that one moment of perfect, absurd justice, it made her a legend anyway. And Pyrrhus? He got what he chased all his life, a place in history. But not as a hero. Not as a builder of empires. He became the man who died because of a rooftop and a ceramic slap from the heavens. Let that sink in. This was a man who navigated Macedonian politics, faced Roman legions, and marched elephants across enemy territory. But when it came to the end, none of it mattered. Because fate doesn't need an army to win. Sometimes it only needs a roof tile. So raise a toast, not just to Pyrrhus, but to the nameless, faceless woman who brought down a king with a flick of the wrist. Because in the wild play called history, sometimes the loudest legacy is written in a quiet, well-aimed act. If there's one death in history that reads more like a horror film than a historical fact, it belongs to Grigory Rasputin, the mystic monk, healer, cult figure, political parasite, and human cockroach of the Russian Empire. His death wasn't just legendary. It was practically overkill with subtitles. To understand Rasputin's ridiculous, terrifying exit, you have to understand the man. He wasn't royalty. He wasn't military. He wasn't elected, appointed, or even invited. He just showed up, a yaorim, peasant from Siberia with wild eyes, a filthy beard, and a whispery voice that could bypass logic and land directly in people's souls. Somehow, this unwashed wanderer wormed his way into the Russian royal family, convincing Empress Alexandra that he could heal her hemophiliac son Alexei, and he did, or at least it seemed like he did. Enough times anyway that the Empress became addicted to his presence. Rasputin didn't just offer prayers, he offered control. He spoke in riddles, seduced powerful women, and made enemies faster than vodka. Disappears at a Russian wedding. To the nobility, he was an infestation. A spiritual parasite burrowed deep in the heart of a dying monarchy. They tried warnings. They tried exile. Then they tried murder. Let's set the stage. It's December 1916. Russia is on the brink of revolution. The economy is collapsing. The people are starving. The Tsar is hopeless. And in the middle of it all stands Rasputin, stinking of power, prophecy, and bad hygiene. A group of nobles, led by Prince Felix Yusupov and Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, decided enough was enough. They didn't just want him gone. They wanted him erased thoroughly. So they made a plan. Step 1. Poison. They invited Rasputin to a small gathering at Yusupov's palace. There was wine, there were cakes, there were warm smiles and deadlier intentions. Rasputin, always, hungry and oddly confident, dug in. What he didn't know, the pastries and wine were laced with enough cyanide to kill a small village. And yet, nothing happened. He ate, he drank, he smiled. He asked for seconds. Panic set in. The assassins glanced at each other, sweat beading, fear rising. Step 2. Gunfire. Yusupov excused himself, returned with a revolver, and shot Rasputin point blank in the chest. Rasputin dropped. Mission accomplished, right? Yusupov leaned in to confirm the kill. Rasputin's eyes flew open. He sat up. He stood. He charged. Suddenly, this wasn't a killing. It was a nightmare, a fever dream where the corpse wouldn't stay down. Yusupov screamed. The others fired again, multiple times into Rasputin's body. He collapsed again, but this time they weren't taking any chances. Step 3. Bludgeoning. They beat him. Hard. Then they tied him up, wrapped him in heavy chains and dragged him to the frozen Neva River. And then, because clearly bullets and poison weren't enough, they threw him into the icy water. That should have been the end. Except when his body was recovered, frozen and broken, his hands were clawing at the ice, scratching, reaching, trying to escape. Rasputin didn't just die. He refused to die properly. Poison, bullets, beatings, drowning, and still he fought the end. His death read like a vampire novel, a cursed legend, a script too wild for television. He became the man who wouldn't stop living no matter how many ways you tried to end him. There are debates, of course. Some historians say the poison melted in the pastries. Others believe the drowning myth was later propaganda. But facts aside, one truth remains: Rasputin's death became more powerful than his life. Because the nobility wanted to end a man. But they created a myth of invincibility, of freakish endurance, of a peasant so intertwined with Russia's fate that even death struggled to claim him. Even his enemies, in trying to destroy him, made him immortal. In that cold, horrifying, drawn-out death, Rasputin became more than a mystic. He became a warning that power doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears a beard, reeks of sweat, and grins through poison. In the end, the empire fell. The royal family was executed. Russia erupted in revolution. But Rasputin, he had already left the stage, in flames, blood, and frozen water. And somehow we're still talking about him, because the man who couldn't die cleanly never really left. For a man who spent his entire life preaching calmness, reason, and emotional control, Chrysippus, the third head of the Stoic school of philosophy, left this world in a moment of absolute, uncontrollable chaos. He didn't die in deep thought. He didn't perish from stress or old age while writing profound truths. No, he died laughing, literally. Let's rewind to set the stage. We're in ancient Greece, somewhere around 206 BCE. Chrysippus is old, bearded, robed in wisdom, and dusty, linen, and universally known as the most serious man alive. He was a Stoic philosopher, one of those rigid, hard-faced thinkers who believed in logic above emotion, discipline above pleasure, and accepting fate with perfect indifference. He wrote more than 700 works, most of them now lost. He dissected ethics, fate, virtue, the cosmos. He wrestled with the idea of happiness not as a pursuit of joy, but as a triumph of mind over mood. And yet, for all his Stoic grandeur, his final moment was a complete betrayal of everything he stood for. According to multiple ancient sources, Chrysippus was watching a donkey eat figs, that's it. A donkey, eating figs, and apparently, this was the funniest thing he had ever seen. But it gets better. In a moment of wit, or maybe irony, he turned to a servant and said, "Give the donkey some wine to wash down the figs." And then he started laughing. Not a chuckle, not a dignified smirk, not the philosopher's nod of amusement. He laughed like a man who had just heard the world's greatest joke. A full-bodied, chest-wheezing, uncontrollable cackling fit. The kind of laugh that scrambles your lungs and squeezes your heart. And then he died, right there. He laughed himself to death. The great Stoic thinker, the man who believed emotion should never override reason, was obliterated by a donkey and a punchline. Let that sink in. This is a man who spent decades teaching others to endure pain, loss, and fear without emotion, who insisted that we must be masters of ourselves, unmoved by desire, grief, or joy. And he was brought down by a wine-drunk donkey eating fruit. If it weren't so real, it would sound like something Aristophanes wrote after too much ouzo. Now, there are skeptics. Some say the story is exaggerated, that maybe he had a stroke while laughing or that the fig and wine part was added later for flair. But even ancient biographers, who weren't exactly stand-up comedians, left the detail in, because it was too perfect, too poetic. It was the ultimate irony, the death of a philosopher who stood for restraint, undone by ridiculous joy. And what's more, it wasn't the first time a Greek thinker had a ridiculous death. One philosopher reportedly choked on a fig. Another fell into a well while staring at the stars. Still another supposedly got eaten by lice. Ancient Greece may have invented democracy and geometry, but they also pioneered tragicomic death. But Chrysippus? He owned his ending. He didn't fall in war. He didn't fade into silence. He laughed, so hard he exited the stage with a smile frozen on his face. Imagine the scene. A courtyard. A dusty breeze. A few disciples gathered ready to absorb his latest doctrine. Instead, they find their master collapsed, face red, robes askew, the donkey still munching figs nearby, possibly tipsy. Not exactly the legacy Plato had in mind. But here's the kicker. Chrysippus may have approved. Because while Stoics preached control, they also believed in accepting fate. If death comes laughing, so be it. There's a strange kind of cosmic balance to it. A man who mastered the mind, falling victim not to war or disease, but to joy, unfiltered and pure. And maybe that's the lesson. Maybe in that moment, watching an animal enjoy something so human and absurd, he saw through the rigid layers of his own philosophy and into something freer. Maybe he realized that laughter, like pain, was part of the deal. Maybe for the first time he let go. Or maybe it was just a really funny donkey. Either way, Chrysippus left behind more than logic charts and ethical debates. He left behind a death no one could forget. Centuries later, we don't quote his treatises on virtue. We don't memorize his writings on fate. But we do remember this: the philosopher who died laughing at a donkey with a mouthful of figs. And honestly, that's not a bad way to go. In the long, syrupy scroll of royal history, some monarchs are remembered for their conquests, others for their legislation, some for their cruelty, and then there's King Adolf Frederick of Sweden, remembered forever, for eating himself to death. Yes, that's the whole headline. He wasn't assassinated, he wasn't overthrown in a revolution. He didn't die in battle. He died because he loved dessert a little too much. Adolf Frederick ruled Sweden in the mid-18th century, during a time of relative peace and political weirdness. The monarchy was already losing power, parliament was on the rise, and the king was increasingly a ceremonial figure. Less warrior king, more well-dressed national mascot. He wasn't particularly infamous or inspiring. There were no grand declarations, or world-shaking wars under his crown. No libraries burned, no cities razed. He was known for being present. A man who liked snuff, silverware, and the sweet, sugary trappings of royal indulgence. But on Fat Tuesday, 1771, Adolf Frederick did something truly historic. He sat down for what was supposed to be a rich, festive meal before Lent began, a night of indulgence, tradition, and giving your body one last hug before the fasting season. But the king? He turned it into his personal culinary apocalypse. According to the records, and yes, the Swedish court actually documented this, he consumed the following in a single sitting: lobster caviar sauerkraut, smoked herring champagne, and 14 servings of his favorite dessert, semlor. Let's pause for a moment and meet the semla. This isn't just a sweet. It's a cultural icon in Sweden. Imagine a soft cardamom-spiced bun, hollowed out and filled with rich almond paste, topped with a generous crown of whipped cream, and served floating in a bowl of warm milk. It's luxurious, delicate, and, when done right, divine. Now imagine eating 14 of them. 14. That's not a treat. That's an act of war against your own digestive system. Soon after this gluttonous victory lap, the king reportedly complained of stomach pains, which is putting it lightly. His entire internal system was likely staging a full-scale rebellion, and then he died. Officially, the cause was listed as digestive problems. Unofficially, everyone knew the king had been conquered by dessert. It too wasn't poison. It wasn't treachery. It was a pastry. In a world where monarchs often died on the battlefield or in dark political plots, Adolf Frederick managed to eat his way into legend. He didn't die nobly, but he died authentically. There's a strange poetry in it too. Here was a king who held no great power, waged no wars, and changed no empires. His reign was a mild drizzle in history's storm, but on his way out he gave the world something unforgettable. A tale so absurd, so completely human that it echoes through time. The Swedish press, restrained as always, referred to him as the king who died after a hearty meal. But the truth was more dramatic. He was a man undone not by scandal but by whipped cream and warm milk. And Sweden, being Sweden, didn't bury the dessert with the king. To this day, every year on Fat Tuesday, the Swedish people still celebrate with semlor, now mass-produced in bakeries across the country. And every year someone somewhere tells the story of the king who loved them to death. There's even a dark joke among historians. He was Sweden's only monarch to be officially defeated by almonds. But perhaps we should be kind. In a world filled with violent ends, bitter legacies, and bloody history, there's something oddly comforting about Adolf Frederick's fate. He didn't fall from grace or die screaming on a battlefield. He fell asleep in luxury, full to the brim, happy, maybe even a little smug. He left the world the way many of us would secretly want to. Warm, full, satisfied. If there's a lesson in his death, maybe it's this. Know your limits, respect the semla, and never underestimate the power of dessert, because history may forget your reign, but it will never forget your plate. If there was ever a philosopher who treated society like it was a joke, and himself like the punchline, it was Diogenes of Sinope. He was dirty, brilliant, rude, unbothered, and utterly free. While other thinkers wore robes and held lectures in marble courtyards, Diogenes lived in a giant clay jar, not a barrel, historians insist it was a jar, slept under the stars, and carried nothing but a cloak, a staff, and a bowl, until he realized he could just cup his hands to drink and threw the bowl away. He was the embodiment of the Cynic philosophy, that civilization was corrupt, luxuries were lies, and virtue was found in rejecting it all. He spat on wealth, mocked power, and taunted thinkers who took themselves too seriously, and he practiced what he preached, with a flair for the dramatic. He relieved himself in public. He once plucked a chicken and declared it a man to mock, Plato's definition of humanity. He wandered through Athens with a lantern in daylight, claiming to look for an honest man. And when Alexander the Great, yes, the world conqueror himself, came to visit Diogenes, stood before him and said, "Ask anything you wish of me." Diogenes barely looked up and said, "Yes, move, you're blocking the sun." This was not a man interested in compromise. And so, it's no surprise that his death is as strange and as stubborn as his life. But first, we must understand one thing. No one agrees on how Diogenes died. Ancient sources are divided, which for a man who defied being boxed in feels incredibly appropriate. Version 1 says he died after eating raw octopus, because of course he did. Version 2 claims he was bitten by a dog. A tragic but hilariously poetic fate for a man who was often called dog-like in manner and philosophy. But the most famous, and strangely the most fitting version says this: he died because he held his breath. Voluntarily. No illness, no attack, no accident, just done. This version tells of an old Diogenes, tired not from age but from human stupidity, the futility of society, the endless nonsense of life. And so, one day, he simply decided, no more. He lay down, closed his eyes, took a breath, and refused to take another. Now, biologically, that's nearly impossible. The body fights back. The brain begs. But Diogenes wasn't most people. This was a man who lived without comfort, without vanity, without fear of shame. He had tamed every impulse. Maybe, just maybe, he tamed his final one too. To his followers, it wasn't death. It was a final act of philosophy, a middle finger to mortality, a protest against existence, a declaration that even life itself couldn't tell him what to do. There's something haunting and beautiful about it. No crowds weeping, no royal deathbed, no fanfare, just a man lying in his jar fading away like mist and on his own terms. And the world, shockingly, respected it. He was buried with honors, and a pillar was erected in his name. That's right. The man who mocked statues and sneered at legacy was given both. Because even those who hated him knew he was too sharp to ignore. He didn't build an empire. He didn't write volumes of treatises. But Diogenes left a legacy etched in behavior. He showed the world what it meant to live without apology, to reject the lie of wealth, the mask of manners, the prison of possessions. His very existence was a performance piece, a critique, a mirror held up to society, and the reflection was ugly. And his death? It was the final chapter in his lifelong prank on civilization. So what's the lesson here? Maybe it's that we don't need to go out in flames or beheaded glory. Maybe sometimes the most powerful act is to simply say no, to lies, to excess, to noise. Or maybe, just maybe, Diogenes didn't teach a lesson at all. Maybe he just laughed at us for thinking there had to be one. In a Rome ruled by blades and betrayals. where senators sharpened their words like knives and civil war could break out between lunch and dinner, most men clung to life with the desperation of a drowning swimmer, but not Lucius Junius Brutus Demisippus. He walked into death with a shrug, a smirk, and the sarcasm of a man who'd already read the final chapter. You probably haven't heard his name in the average history class. He wasn't Caesar, he wasn't Cicero, he didn't lead a grand rebellion or rewrite the laws of the Republic. But for a brief shining moment, Lucius Demisippus became the poster child for swagger in the face of execution. Here's what happened. In the last gasps of the Roman Republic, the city was a bloody theater of ambition. Two political giants were at war, Gaius Marius, the populist champion, and Lucius Cornelius Sulla, the patrician butcher with a military heart of stone. When Sulla returned to Rome with his battle-hardened army, it wasn't just a coup, it was a cleansing. He didn't sweep the Senate, he purged it. Those loyal to Marius were rounded up, imprisoned, and marked for immediate execution. There were no trials, no eloquent pleas, just names etched on prescription lists, and men dragged away like livestock. Lucius Demisippus was one of them, a general, a loyal Marian, a man who chose the losing side. He and a group of fellow condemned prisoners were being led to the slaughter, chains rattling, soldiers sneering, the air thick with resignation. Most of the men wept, some prayed, a few cursed the gods, but not Demisippus. As the line moved slowly toward death, one of the prisoners broke. He began sobbing uncontrollably, falling to his knees, begging for mercy, and Demisippus, cool as chilled wine, turned to him and said, "Why weep, fool? Did you not know what business we came here for?" That's it. One line. No fear, no drama, just pure, uncut Roman dry wit in the face of oblivion. He didn't scream. He didn't beg. He didn't try to bribe the guards or claw his way free. He met death like it was a boring dinner party and he'd already eaten. In an age obsessed with honor and theatrical exits, Demisippus's moment wasn't loud, but it echoed through time. Because in that instant, he wasn't just a man. He was a mood. His sneering remark wasn't bravado, it was clarity. The knowledge that when the sword comes, there's no point in flinching. And when history is writing its obituaries, the ones who go out mocking the executioner get a footnote no blade can erase. Was he a great general? Not particularly. Did he change the fate of Rome? No. But he did something rarer. He refused to perform panic. Because in ancient Rome, the manner of your death mattered. It was your final performance, your last script. A bad death could stain your name for generations. A good one, it could elevate a nobody into myth, and Demisippus delivered his line with the precision of a dagger between the ribs of fear. The real tragedy? His body was dumped. His grave was unmarked. His name nearly lost to the churn of history. Rome was too busy bleeding itself dry to remember quiet acts of dignity. But someone, somewhere, remembered that line and wrote it down. Because sometimes, in the theater of execution, it's not the sword that writes the story, it's the one-liner before the blade drops. Lucius Demisippus didn't want pity, he didn't want legacy. He wanted to die without giving his enemies the satisfaction of fear. And that is epic. So the next time you're cornered, overwhelmed, facing something terrifying, channel Demisippus. Crack a joke, deliver the line. Don't flinch, because sometimes dignity isn't in the resistance, it's in the indifference. There are mad kings and then there's Caligula, Rome's golden boy turned bloody nightmare. A man who began as a beacon of hope and ended as a symbol of everything that happens when absolute power eats itself alive. His real name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, but nobody called him that. The people named him Caligula, meaning little boots, after the tiny military sandals he wore as a child marching alongside his general father. It was meant to be cute, it didn't stay that way. When Caligula rose to power in 37 AD, Rome exhaled. The previous emperor, Tiberius, had been a bitter recluse who ruled from an island and executed people for blinking wrong. So when Caligula took the throne, young, handsome, charming, the living grandson of Mark Antony and great-grandson of Augustus, Rome rejoiced. And for a brief moment everything was perfect. He freed political prisoners, gave bonuses to soldiers, held lavish games for the people. The city was blooming again. Then, within months, everything cracked. Some historians say he fell seriously ill and never recovered. Others claim it was the weight of the purple robe that poisoned his mind. But what followed wasn't governance. It was a one-man performance of unhinged divinity. He didn't just claim to be a god. He demanded temples. He didn't just tax the people. He declared war on Neptune, the god of the sea, and ordered his soldiers to stab the ocean and collect seashells as trophies. He filled the Senate with his horse, Incitatus, not as a metaphor, but as a sign that the institution meant so little to him. Even a four-legged animal could do the job. He dressed as Venus. He had dinners with the moon. He built floating palaces and forced guests to watch executions between courses. He drained the treasury on luxuries and cruelty. He turned palaces into brothels. He loved watching people squirm. The problem was, people were watching back. Behind the scenes, the Senate, the Praetorian Guard, and even palace staff were growing restless. Because even Rome, the most decadent empire in history, had limits, and Caligula danced right over them. He insulted generals, humiliated senators, threatened the nobility. He told everyone he could kill them and bring them back, just for fun. Eventually, someone decided enough was enough. It wasn't a rebellion. It wasn't war. It was a hallway. One night in 41 AD, Caligula was leaving a theater performance in his own palace. Surrounded by guards, flanked by nobles, probably wearing something silk and absurd, he walked through a quiet passage, and then the whispers stopped. A sword flashed, a man named Cassius Chaerea, a member of the Praetorian Guard, and a man Caligula had spent months mocking for his voice and masculinity struck first. Then others joined. They didn't just kill Caligula, they ripped him apart. Stab after stab, they carved rage into flesh, spilling years of humiliation, madness, and fear onto the marble floor. Some say he was stabbed 30 times. Others say over 100. No one can agree on the number, but they agree on the message. This wasn't a political assassination. This was a public exorcism. His body was left to rot. His wife and daughter were also murdered. His statues were torn down. His name, once shouted in celebration, became a curse. Rome had purged its fever, but the fever left a scar, because Caligula's reign was a warning carved into history. What happens when unchecked power fuses with theatrical madness? When a man mistakes cruelty for comedy, and the empire becomes his stage. His death wasn't tragic. It was inevitable. You cannot set yourself above gods, humiliate your protectors, bankrupt your empire, and expect applause forever. He died, not because of who he was, but because of what he dared to become. An emperor so far gone that even Rome, decided he had gone too far. And that should terrify us. Because Caligula's story isn't just about one man going mad. It's about what happens when no one dares to say no. When silence becomes complicity. When the robes get heavier, the masks darker, and no one can tell the difference between applause and fear. His death was messy, vengeful, and poetic. And maybe that's the legacy he would have wanted. Because Caligula never feared death. He feared being forgotten. And here we are still talking about him. Some deaths are tragic, some are violent. And then there's the death of George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, a man who looked at fate, considered his options, and allegedly said, "If I must die, pour me a drink." His death wasn't just historic, it was theatrical. Because while many royals were beheaded, hanged, stabbed, or poisoned, George chose to go out swimming in a barrel of his favorite wine. Let's rewind. George Plantagenet was born in 1449 into the madness of the Wars of the Roses, a brutal, blood-soaked civil war between the houses of York and Lancaster, each clawing for the English throne. These weren't just family feuds. They were medieval Game of Thrones on steroids. George was the younger brother of King Edward IV and older brother to Richard III. That made him royalty, but not quite royalty enough. Close enough to smell the crown, but not close enough to wear. Oh, and that's a dangerous place to stand in a kingdom built on suspicion. At first, George sided with his brother Edward and was richly rewarded. He was given titles, lands, castles, everything short of a crown. But soon, ambition started to ferment, like the Malmsey wine he loved so dearly. George, like many medieval nobles, didn't know the meaning of loyalty for too long. He switched sides, joined the enemy, Lancaster, married into their power structure, and even helped orchestrate rebellions against his own brother. For a while it worked, until it didn't. Eventually the tides turned. The Yorkists regained control. George begged forgiveness, and Edward reluctantly welcomed him back. But nothing was ever the same. Once a traitor, always a suspect. George couldn't help himself. He began plotting again, whispering again, undermining his brother's court. He accused Edward's wife of witchcraft. He arrested people on his own authority. He even executed one of the Queen's servants without trial. And Edward? He finally had enough. In 1477, George was arrested and charged with high treason. The details were vague, but the punishment was clear: death. Now here's where the story takes a turn toward legend. Edward didn't want a public scandal. This was his own brother, after all. So rather than chop off his head in front of a crowd, the execution was done in secret, behind castle walls, away from the jeering mob. But the method? That's the part that made George eternal. According to centuries of chroniclers, including the Tudor historian Edward Hall, George Plantagenet was drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine. Let's pause here. A butt is not a barrel the size of your beer keg. It's a huge cask, about 126 gallons, over 470 liters, enough to submerge a man and give him one final, if ironic, toast. And Malmsey? It was his favorite. A rich, sweet, fortified wine imported from Greece, velvety, luxurious, and strong enough to kill more than thirst. No one knows if George actually requested this death or if it was a cruel joke by the court. But the story has endured for centuries precisely because it sounds like the kind of death George Plantagenet would have appreciated. Why go out in terror when you can go out in style? Why face the axe when you can face the barrel? It's absurd. It's indulgent. It's Shakespearean, literally. Even William Shakespeare immortalized the scene in Richard III, having George dream of drowning before his murderers carry out the sentence. And in the bard's hands the imagery is rich: wine as blood, drowning as betrayal, indulgence as downfall. Because George's death wasn't just ironic. It was a metaphor made flesh. He had drowned in greed, power, and wine his entire life. He swam in ambition, waded through betrayal, drank deeply from the cup of treachery, and in the end, the cup swallowed him back. His death became a fable. A dark toast whispered in court halls: be careful what you drink to. It might just drink you. Of course, some historians dispute the story. They say it's too convenient, that no official document mentions the wine, that it might have been a quiet execution by other means. But it doesn't matter, because history, as we know, isn't just facts. It's narrative, and this one? Sings. George Plantagenet never wore a crown, he never ruled a kingdom. But he did something most royals never managed: he died memorably. So the next time you raise a glass, remember the Duke who may have raised his last from the inside. And maybe, just maybe, sip slowly. The story of Archimedes doesn't end with a triumphant theorem or a final equation. It ends with a soldier's blade and a cry of frustration. It ends not in the halls of science, but in the dust of war, amid conquest, confusion, and a single sacred circle drawn in sand. He was one of the greatest minds the world has ever known. A mathematician, an engineer, a physicist, a philosopher. a man so far ahead of his time that 2,000 years later we're still catching up. Born in the ancient city of Syracuse around 287 BCE, Archimedes was a living paradox, a reclusive thinker in a world obsessed with conquest. While others chased glory with swords and fire, he chased truth with compasses and ideas. He discovered the principle of buoyancy in his bathtub, created the foundations of calculus before calculus existed, designed weapons of war so advanced that invading armies thought they were facing a magician. He calculated pi with terrifying precision, built levers and pulleys that could lift ships, change the world, quietly, patiently, eternally. And he died for one reason: he wouldn't look up. Let's set the scene. The year is 212 BCE. Syracuse, Archimedes' home city, is under siege by the Romans, led by General Marcus Claudius Marcellus, one of Rome's most respected commanders. The city had resisted Rome for 3 long years, thanks in large part to Archimedes' inventions. He wasn't on the battlefield, but he might as well have been. Using nothing but gears, ropes, counterweights, and brilliance, Archimedes designed catapults, mirrors, and cranes that repelled entire fleets. Some say he used parabolic mirrors to set ships ablaze, a legend debated but never forgotten. But even genius can't hold off fate forever. Eventually, the Romans breached the walls. Syracuse fell. And here's where history turns cruel. Marcellus had given specific orders: do not harm Archimedes. The Roman general admired the scientist deeply, even intending to bring him to Rome as an honored guest, a living trophy of intellect. But soldiers in war aren't known for nuance. Somewhere in the chaos of victory, a Roman soldier entered a courtyard. There on the ground crouched an old man, Archimedes. He was hunched over, drawing geometric figures in the dust. Circles, arcs, calculations born of a mind that never stopped seeking. He didn't look up. He didn't acknowledge the soldier. He was busy, and when the soldier barked at him to rise, when he demanded Archimedes, "Leave the spot," the old man simply replied, "Do not disturb my circles." That was it. That one sentence, spoken with the calm obsession of a man deep in thought, became his last. The soldier, either offended or indifferent, struck him down. Blood splashed across the sand, soaking the very diagrams Archimedes had been sketching. A world-changing intellect ended by a nameless blade just like that. No duel, no fanfare. Just genius, silenced in the dirt. Marcellus was furious when he heard. Accounts say he punished the soldier, apologized to Archimedes' family, and ensured his burial was honorable. But it was too late. The greatest scientific mind of the ancient world was gone, killed not by age, illness, or enemy generals, but by ignorance and impatience. And so the irony of Archimedes' death burned itself into legend. A man who gave the world so much, killed for caring too much about a circle. His death became a metaphor, symbol of what happens when power and intellect collide, when genius refuses to bend, when war tramples silence, when the mind is interrupted by muscle. But maybe it's fitting. Archimedes didn't die in a bed. He didn't fade away with time. He died doing what he loved, died refusing to break focus, died defending a truth that only he could see in that moment. He could have run, he could have begged, he could have spoken Latin. But no, he held the line, with a compass and a whisper. Do not disturb my circles. It's one of history's most heartbreaking epitaphs. Because in that one sentence lies everything Archimedes stood for: the pursuit of knowledge, the sacredness of thought, the stubbornness of genius, the refusal to let chaos disrupt clarity, and maybe the belief that some things, some lines in the sand, are worth dying for. History often forgets the names of the enslaved, but not Spartacus. His is the name that thundered across battlefields, haunted the halls of Rome, and still echoes centuries later, whispered whenever the powerless rise up and say, "No more." His death wasn't witnessed with certainty. His body was never found. and yet his final stand became one of the loudest silences in history. Let's go back. He wasn't born a rebel. He wasn't born a hero. He was born in Thrace, likely around 111 BCE. A soldier captured by Roman forces, sold into slavery, and sent to a place more infamous than the battlefield, the gladiator school of Capua. There, chained in sweat and blood, Spartacus trained not to survive but to die entertaining Rome, to kill for applause, to perish for pageantry, to bleed for sport. But inside him burned something Rome couldn't chain. He had seen war, he knew freedom, and he would not spend his final breath feeding their thirst for cruelty. So, in 73 BCE, Spartacus broke free. Alongside about 70 fellow gladiators, he led one of the most famous prison breaks in history. Armed at first with kitchen utensils and stolen blades, they fled into the Italian countryside. They didn't just run. They recruited, and what began as a whisper in the shadows soon swelled into a roar of rebellion. Slaves joined in by the thousands, peasants, farmers, shepherds, entire families. Within months, Spartacus was at the head of an army of the forgotten, tens of thousands strong, fueled not by armor or gold but by rage and memory. Rome laughed. At first, then Spartacus started winning. Battle after battle, his army defeated Roman legions. He didn't just outfight them, he outthought them, ambushing supply lines, slipping through mountain passes, turning former slaves into warriors with nothing to lose. He had no empire, no treasury, no navy, just willpower and grit. Some say he wanted to escape, lead his people north over the Alps away from Rome's reach. Others say he wanted vengeance, a march into the heart of the Republic itself. Historians still debate his plan, but Rome, finally taking him seriously, unleashed its fury. In 71 BCE, the Senate sent one of its most ruthless generals, Marcus Licinius Crassus, to crush the rebellion. Crassus built trenches, fortifications, traps. He surrounded Spartacus and forced the uprising into a final, brutal stand in southern Italy. The battle that followed wasn't recorded in precise detail. No historian stood on that field, sketching lines and narrating tactics. But what we know is this: Spartacus did not run. He didn't hide behind his army. He didn't beg for terms. He charged. On the final day, surrounded and outnumbered, Spartacus is said to have fought his way toward Crassus himself, cutting through soldiers like fate in motion, trying to end the war with a single stroke of his blade. He didn't make it. He was wounded, surrounded, overwhelmed, and then gone. No one ever found his body. Some say it was burned. Some say it was buried among the masses. Some say his remains were left to rot with the thousands of others who dared to rise. Because when the dust settled, Rome made sure the world would not forget its revenge. 1,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, stretching over 100 miles from Capua to Rome. A line of bodies, a gallery of agony, a warning carved into wood and bone. But even then, even as the wind whispered through the crosses, Spartacus lived on. He had done what no one thought possible. He had united the broken, shaken the empire, and reminded the world that chains don't always hold. His death wasn't witnessed, but it was felt, in every heartbeat of rebellion that followed, in every slave that dared dream of more, in every soul who read the name Spartacus and stood taller. Because Spartacus didn't just die, he refused to die quietly. And sometimes, that's all it takes to become eternal. If ever a man died by the very thing he worshipped, it was Marcus Licinius Crassus, Rome's richest citizen, the silent partner of Caesar and Pompey, and the man whose hunger for gold led him to one of history's most symbolic deaths. Born into wealth and power, Crassus wasn't just rich, he was unimaginably rich. He wasn't content with land or influence, he wanted everything. The mines, the markets, the votes, the titles, the glory. When Rome burned, Crassus saw opportunity. When men were auctioned, Crassus bought them cheap and sold them back richer. When houses collapsed, he sent in teams of enslaved architects to rebuild, and then leased them for profit. He was a man who didn't just chase money, he embodied greed. But Crassus wasn't satisfied with coins. He wanted immortality. And in Rome, immortality wasn't found in bank ledgers. It was found in military conquest. He had wealth. He had politics. What he didn't have was a legacy soaked in blood and banners. Caesar had Gaul, Pompey had the East, and Crassus, he had envy. So in 53 BCE, Crassus set his sights on the Parthian Empire, an eastern powerhouse whose cavalry could split a man open from a mile away. Modern-day Iran and Iraq, a land of deserts, heat, and warriors who fought like smoke, swift, brutal, untouchable. Crassus, swollen with pride and gold, marched east with 7 legions, about 35,000 men, and almost no respect for the terrain, the culture, or the enemy. He expected plunder. He found hell. The Parthians didn't meet him head-on. They danced. They vanished into the dust. Their archers rode in circles and rained death from afar, their arrows curving like whispers. Crassus's men, trained for close combat, couldn't touch them. The Roman square, an unbreakable force against infantry, was worthless against ghosts on horseback. Then came the disaster of Carrhae. In the desert heat, with morale crumbling and supply lines cut, Crassus was tricked into peace talks. He was led to believe a negotiation was possible. His officers begged him not to go, but pride doesn't negotiate. He rode out with a handful of men to parley, and there, in the sand, the Parthians grabbed him. His escort was slaughtered. Crassus himself was beheaded, his body desecrated, his ambitions shattered. But they weren't done, because the Parthians understood symbolism. They knew what Crassus truly worshipped. So according to legend, they melted gold, molten, gleaming, scalding, and poured it down his throat. Drink, Crassus, drink your fill. With those mocking words, they baptized him in the very thing he lived for, not water, not wine, but gold. And so ended the life of Rome's wealthiest man, choked by his own obsession, killed not by sword or spear, but by the cruel irony of poetic justice. His head was later sent to the Parthian court, used as a prop in a Greek tragedy performance, because even in death, Crassus was theater. His death sent shockwaves through Rome. It humiliated the Republic. It shattered the uneasy alliance between Caesar and Pompey, and it marked the beginning of the fall of the First Triumvirate, a political trio that had held the Republic in its fists. But more than that, Crassus's death became a warning, a tale whispered in the Senate halls, in Roman baths, in dark corners, where ambition sharpened itself like a blade. Be careful what you treasure, for one day it might claim you from within. Crassus wanted glory. He got legend. He wanted eternal life through conquest. He got eternal irony. He thought gold would make him immortal. It made him a parable. Because you can hoard power, you can collect wealth, but no man can outbid fate, especially when fate is watching with a melting pot and a smirk. History remembers Cleopatra VII, the Queen of the Nile, the last pharaoh of Egypt, the lover of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, the woman who died with a snake to her breast and a kingdom at her feet. But her daughter, Cleopatra Selene II, is a ghost, a whisper, a woman born in the ashes of empires who became a queen in her own right. And yet, when she died, she seemed to vanish into the cracks of time, as if history looked away. And maybe that's the greatest tragedy of all. She was the child of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, a union that shook the Roman world. Born around 40 BCE, Selene entered life as royalty, surrounded by marble and lotus, silver and silk. She was raised in palaces carved from myth, her cradle rocked by the rhythm of 2 collapsing worlds. Because even as she took her first steps, her parents were spiraling toward doom. Rome had declared war. Octavian, soon to be Augustus Caesar, marched against them with propaganda, armies, and destiny on his side. When the final battle came at Actium, it wasn't just a military loss, it was a historical fracture. Mark Antony fell on his sword. Cleopatra, surrounded and defeated, chose her death with ceremony, either by snakebite, poison, or her own blade, depending on which ancient rumor you trust. Selene was just 10 years old when she became an orphan of empire. Rome did not kill her. Instead, Augustus, ever the strategist, took her and her twin brother as trophies. Paraded through the streets of Rome in golden chains, they were displayed as the children of a broken dynasty, the last remnants of a world that no longer existed. But Selene, unlike her parents, would not be used for tragedy. She learned. She waited. She adapted. Raised in the household of Octavia, the sister of Augustus and the former wife of her father, Mark Antony, Selene was given the rarest of second chances. She was taught Latin, politics, diplomacy, the art of smiling through betrayal, the skill of surviving without threatening, and then came her marriage. Augustus sent her to Mauritania in North Africa to marry Juba II, the Romanized king of a Berber kingdom. It was a political alliance, yes, but not a punishment. Juba was a scholar, a historian, a ruler with vision. And with Selene at his side, Mauritania became a beacon of culture, art, and stability in the region. Together, they ruled a kingdom on the edge of Rome, but they did so with grace. Selene turned her exile into influence. Coins were minted with her image, statues carved in her likeness, temples built in her name. She transformed Caesarea, the capital, into a glittering port city. She commissioned architecture inspired by her mother's Egypt and her father's Rome. She supported poets and priests, astronomers and artisans. She kept her parents' memory alive, not with rebellion but with legacy. And then, she disappeared. The records stop. We don't know how she died. No scroll details her final words. No monument marks the day of her passing. One Roman historian simply notes in passing that she was dead by 5 BCE. That's it. No body, no grave, no royal inscription. For a woman born of two of the most infamous lovers in history, for a queen who helped build a thriving kingdom, Selene's death is an open wound in the record. But perhaps that silence is more powerful than 1,000 swords. Because Selene's death wasn't just a fading heartbeat, it was a quiet resistance. She survived everything designed to erase her. The fall of Egypt, the humiliation of captivity, the weaponization of her lineage, the weight of her name. She didn't burn like Cleopatra. She didn't fall like Antony. She slipped through the cracks of empire, quietly shaping the world in ways that emperors never noticed and never could control. Her children, likely raised Roman, went on to play roles in the politics of the empire. Her husband mourned her, with inscriptions that hint at deep affection. The city she helped build outlived her for centuries. But she herself, she became a question. A daughter of legends, a queen in exile, a woman born into fire, who vanished like smoke. So maybe her death isn't tragic because it's forgotten. Maybe it's tragic because it wasn't meant to be remembered. Augustus couldn't afford her myth. Rome couldn't bear her name. So history simply turned the page. And Selene, born into spectacle, exited with nothing but silence. His name was Ptolemy of Mauritania, and he died not because he committed treason, not because he rebelled against Rome, not even because he lost a war, but because he made one simple mistake. He looked too much like a king. Let's back up. Ptolemy was born into royalty, but also into a fragile legacy. He was the son of Cleopatra Selene II, the daughter of Cleopatra VII and Mark Antony, and Juba II, the scholarly king of Mauritania. That made him both Egyptian and Roman, African and imperial, and by blood a descendant of two of the most famous lovers in history. He was empire on two legs, diplomacy in the shape of a man. Raised in North Africa under the watchful eye of Rome, Ptolemy was no rebel. He followed the rules, paid his taxes, honored Augustus and Tiberius. He kept Mauritania stable, peaceful, and productive. His cities flourished. His treasury was healthy. He was a model client king, exactly the kind of ruler Rome preferred to have on its borders. And then he made a deadly decision. He visited Rome, not to stir unrest, not to form alliances, but simply to pay homage, to show respect to the emperor at the time, Caligula. And that's where things went horribly, irreversibly wrong. When Ptolemy entered the city, he did so in style. As was customary for foreign royalty, he wore his ceremonial robes, rich, embroidered, majestic. His crown gleamed in the sunlight. His carriage was lavish. His bearing was proud. He looked in every way like a man descended from pharaohs and emperors. The people of Rome stopped to stare. They whispered, admired. Some even cheered. Because in a world where the emperor was feared more than loved, the sight of a foreign king with true regal poise stirred something ancient in the hearts of the crowd. And Caligula saw it. He saw the crowds admire Ptolemy. He saw the man's elegance, the ease with which he commanded attention. And above all, he saw something that shook him to his core. A man more kingly than the king himself. Caligula, who styled himself a god, who threatened senators, insulted generals, and turned Rome into a stage of madness, could not bear to be upstaged, especially not by a man with real bloodlines, real charm, real dignity. So he had Ptolemy executed. No trial, no charges, just a command. The reason? Historians say it was simply because Ptolemy wore a cloak that Caligula thought was too splendid, that he looked too royal, that he made the emperor feel too small. And so, the king of Mauritania, the last thread of Cleopatra's line, was snuffed out for outshining a tyrant. The murder shocked Rome's political elite. This wasn't a rebel. Ptolemy had been an ally, a stabilizer. Killing him wasn't just unnecessary, it was insane. But Caligula was already plunging deep into madness, and Ptolemy became one more sacrifice on the altar of ego. Back in Mauritania, his sudden death left a power vacuum. The region, once peaceful, erupted into rebellion. Rome had to send in troops. Thousands died in a war that never needed to happen, all because one emperor couldn't handle another man wearing a better outfit. And perhaps that's the cruelest irony of all. Ptolemy died with dignity, but he died because his dignity made someone else feel threatened. He never raised a sword, never raised his voice, but his very existence was a threat to a madman wearing a crown too large for his head. And so his story, once rich with promise, ended with a dagger drawn from jealousy. He wasn't the first to be killed for appearing powerful. He certainly wasn't the last, but he might be one of the only kings in history who died not from what he did, but from how he carried himself, in silence, in splendor, in style. And for that, history remembers him, not as a tyrant, not as a warmonger, but as a man too regal for the empire that murdered him. In the pantheon of engineering legends, few names stand as tall and fall as tragically as Isambard Kingdom Brunel. He was a man of towering vision, a Victorian titan with a stovepipe, hat and soot on his sleeves, a dreamer with a ruler in one hand and the entire British Empire in the other. He wasn't just building bridges, he was building the future. And yet, in the end, that very future turned on him. Brunel was born in 1806, son of a famous engineer, but quickly outgrew his father's shadow. He designed the Clifton Suspension Bridge, which floated like lace over the Avon Gorge. He built railways, tunnels, and docks that expanded the industrial arteries of Britain. He brought steam into its golden age. To his critics, he was reckless. To his admirers, he was a magician with blueprints. But his most audacious dream came in the form of a ship. Not just any ship. The SS Great Eastern, a leviathan of iron and ambition, almost 700 feet long, designed to carry 4,000 passengers from Britain to India without refueling. In an era where wooden ships still ruled the seas, the Great Eastern was a floating prophecy. It was 5 times larger than any ship before it, powered by paddle wheels, propellers, and massive steam engines. It had 2 sets of engines, 5 chimneys, and a double iron hull. It was an oceanic cathedral, built not just to sail but to redefine what sailing could be. Brunel poured everything into it, his mind, his health, his pride. And slowly, it broke him. The ship was plagued with delays, budget nightmares, and technical failures. The iron plates buckled, boilers exploded, workers died, investors pulled out. The public mocked him. Newspapers called the project cursed. Still, Brunel pressed on. He oversaw every rivet, tinkered with every screw, lost sleep, lost weight, lost time, but not belief. By 1859, the ship was nearly ready. The Great Eastern, the impossible machine, was preparing for her maiden voyage. And Brunel, he was exhausted. He had suffered from years of stress-induced illness, insomnia, fatigue, even temporary paralysis from overwork. But he refused to rest. He was a man racing against time, against critics, against the growing tremor in his chest. Then, just days before the launch, he collapsed. The official story? A stroke. But the truth runs deeper. He had insisted on being photographed next to the ship's massive paddle wheel. As the camera was being set up, he lit a cigar, leaned against the rail, and smiled. Then he staggered and fell. Some say it was the tension of it all, years of pressure, disappointment, humiliation. Others say it was fate, waiting for the final act. Brunel died 10 days later, never seeing his ship complete its first voyage. The man who bent rivers, pierced hills, and defied oceans died not from fire or failure, but from the weight of his own ambition. And the ship? The Great Eastern sailed, but she was cursed. On her maiden voyage, a steam pipe burst, killing several crew members. Passengers fled in fear. Later, the ship struck an uncharted rock. Her engines failed. She never carried the passengers she was meant to. She was used for laying transatlantic cables, then as a floating billboard. Eventually, she was scrapped. And as workers dismantled her, they made a horrifying discovery. 2 dead workers, sealed inside the double hull for decades. Their tools lying beside them, forgotten during construction. A metaphor, some say. Brunel wasn't one of them, but in a way he might as well have been. He poured himself into that ship. Every bolt, every plate, every line of metal was part of him, and when it was done, it took him with it. But Brunel's story doesn't end with failure, because today, he's remembered not for the Great Eastern's doom, but for the sheer audacity of his vision. He looked at the 19th century and saw the 21st. He imagined futures others were too afraid to build. And while his greatest project broke him, it also defined him. He died trying to push the world forward. Not in retreat, not in disgrace, but in motion. In the long scroll of Japan's history, few names are written with both reverence and rebellion. Like Saigo Takamori, the man often called the last true samurai. His life was a clash between 2 worlds. The old one he came from and the new one he refused to kneel before. He didn't just die in battle, he died for a disappearing way of life. Born in 1828, Saigo Takamori came of age as the samurai class was crumbling. For centuries, samurai had been Japan's elite, warriors of discipline, loyalty, and the blade. But by the mid-19th century, Japan was facing pressure from Western powers, steamships knocking on its ports, and modernity demanding entry. And Takamori? He was caught between the call of tradition and the pull of the future. At first, he was part of that change. He helped lead the Meiji Restoration, a political revolution that toppled the shogunate and restored imperial power. He fought for unity, reform, and national pride. He helped the emperor modernize Japan, abolish feudal domains, establish new schools, bring in Western science. But modernity came with a price. The samurai were no longer needed. Their swords, their stipends, their sacred code, all swept aside, for rifles, railroads, and bureaucracy. Takamori watched his world be dismantled piece by piece, and then something inside him broke. By the 1870s, he was disillusioned. He saw the new Japan as a betrayal. Corrupt politicians, arrogant Western imitators, a government that had erased its soul in pursuit of steel and suits. So he left politics, and he returned to the south, to Satsuma, his homeland. There, surrounded by other disaffected samurai, he trained, he taught, he prepared, and in 1877, he rebelled. It wasn't a coup. It wasn't a power grab. It was a funeral procession for an entire era. The Satsuma Rebellion began with just a few thousand men, samurai in full armor, mounted and honorable, against a modern army of tens of thousands, armed with rifles, cannons, and Western tactics. It was doomed from the start. But that was the point. Takamori didn't rebel because he thought he'd win. He rebelled because he believed some things are worth dying for. He led his men north. They fought fierce, brutal skirmishes, often winning against impossible odds. At Kumamoto, they laid siege to an imperial garrison. But the emperor's army responded with overwhelming force. The rebels were driven back. They starved. They bled. Their ammunition ran out. Yet they marched. Yet they fought. Because for Takamori, honor was heavier than bullets. By September, his army was reduced to a few hundred men, and so they made their final stand at Shiroyama, a misty hill overlooking the city of Kagoshima. It was not a battle. It was a ceremony of death. The imperial army rained shells from gunboats. Artillery ripped through the trees. Takamori's warriors, armed with swords and nostalgia, charged into machine gun fire. It was a massacre, and yet they kept going. Takamori himself was wounded either in the leg or the hip, accounts vary. Unable to stand, bleeding into the soil of his homeland, he turned to a loyal retainer, and then came the final act. Following seppuku, the ritual suicide of the samurai, Takamori either plunged a blade into his belly, or more likely, allowed his companion to behead him, as was tradition for a wounded lord. Either way, he chose his death. He didn't run. He didn't surrender. He died on a hillside, sword in hand, body broken, but honor intact. His head was buried secretly by his followers. His legend was not. The government labeled him a traitor. But the people knew better. They told stories, built statues, named schools and parks after him. A man who stood against the future not because he hated it, but because it forgot where it came from. And years later, the emperor himself pardoned Saigo posthumously, acknowledging that while his rebellion failed, his loyalty never wavered, because Saigo Takamori was not fighting the emperor. He was fighting for the soul of Japan. He became a symbol, not of resistance, but of unshakable principle. In the end, he lost everything. And in doing so, he became eternal. Jesse James didn't die in a blaze of glory. He didn't die on horseback with a gun in each hand. He didn't die outnumbered, surrounded, outgunned. He died while dusting, in a crisp shirt, inside a quiet house facing a wall, and that's what makes it unforgettable. Because Jesse Woodson James, born in 1847, wasn't just a man. He was a myth, a walking contradiction, the line where hero met villain. To some, he was a freedom fighter. To others, a terrorist, a product of a shattered America still bleeding from civil war, where the line between justice and vengeance blurred into fog. He was raised in Missouri, a border state torn apart by the Civil War. As a teenager, Jesse joined a Confederate guerrilla group known as Quantrill's Raiders, a savage militia that burned towns, ambushed Union forces, and left no innocents behind. The war ended, but Jesse's war never did. He and his brother Frank James rode across the Midwest, forming the James Younger Gang. Banks, stagecoaches, trains. They didn't rob. They extracted vengeance. At least that's how they saw it. To the defeated South, they were rebels who kept fighting. To the North, they were criminals with blood on their boots. Over the years, Jesse became more than a man. He was a symbol, a Southern Robin Hood, a legend whispered in saloons and schoolyards. His robberies were coordinated like military strikes. He left no trails, no fingerprints, just stories. But time changes everything. By the 1880s, the gang was falling apart. Most had been captured or killed. Jesse was paranoid, restless, always looking over his shoulder. He used aliases, moved frequently, never slept too soundly. He wore his revolvers like a second skin, but he still needed partners. So he turned to the Ford brothers, Charlie and Robert Ford. Young, eager, worshipful. Jesse brought them into his circle, thinking them loyal. He didn't know that Robert Ford had made a deal with Missouri's governor. The price of betrayal, $10,000 and a pardon. Jesse had no idea the clock was ticking. On April 3, 1882, Jesse James woke up in a rented house in St. Joseph, Missouri. He ate breakfast, read the paper, talked with the Fords like it was any other morning. No plans, no robbery, just a quiet, domestic calm. That was the moment Robert Ford had been waiting for. Then, something strange happened. Jesse noticed that a painting on the wall was crooked. It's a small detail, a human detail. A man so obsessed with survival, still bothered by dust and symmetry. So he stood on a chair. He unbuckled his guns, twin Colt .45s, and placed them gently on the bed. He reached toward the frame, and Robert Ford drew his pistol, one shot, to the back of the head. Jesse collapsed. He was 34 years old, and just like that, the most wanted man in America was gone. He didn't die robbing a train. He died in his socks, in daylight, trying to straighten a picture. It was betrayal of the coldest kind. Ford didn't face him, didn't challenge him. He just waited for Jesse to turn his back, and then ended the myth with a twitch of his finger. And the aftermath? It wasn't glory. The Ford brothers didn't get the welcome they expected. They were not hailed as heroes. They were shunned, ridiculed, spat upon. People didn't celebrate Jesse's death. They mourned it, because even if he was a killer, he was their killer, a man who defied the law, defied the banks, defied the growing machinery of the federal state. He represented the last gasps of the Old West, and his death felt less like justice and more like a coward's ambush. Robert Ford, he became known as the dirty little coward who shot Mr. Howard, Jesse's alias. He was hounded until the end. A few years later, he was shot dead in a saloon by another man with something to prove. Jesse's body was laid in a simple pine box. His epitaph read, "In loving memory of my beloved son, murdered by a traitor and coward whose name is not worthy to appear here." And that says everything. Because Jesse James, whatever he was, bandit, rebel, criminal, icon, didn't die like a hero or a villain. He died like a man caught between centuries. A son of war who couldn't stop fighting. A legend who outlived his own legend, but who in the end could not outlive the simplest truth. Even the fastest gun must eventually lower his guard, and sometimes all it takes is a dusty picture, and a man too eager to shoot. In the proud, marble-chiseled halls of Roman history, the emperors fall like dominoes, stabbed by guards, poisoned by wives, betrayed by friends. But Valerian's fall was something else entirely, because he didn't just lose a battle. He didn't just lose his throne. He lost his dignity, his body, and his soul. Not in Rome, but in chains, far from the empire he once ruled. He is the only Roman emperor in history to be captured alive by an enemy. And what happened next? He was turned into furniture. Let's begin. At the top. Valerian rose to power in 253 AD during a time historians generously refer to as the crisis of the 3rd century. Rome was splitting at the seams, civil wars, plagues, invasions. The borders were bleeding. The army was restless. Emperors rose and fell faster than harvests. Valerian, an aging senator and general, was seen as a stabilizing force, a compromise emperor, a stopgap solution. But he wasn't passive. He was a fighter. In 259 AD, he marched east to confront one of Rome's most dangerous enemies, the Persian Sassanid Empire, led by the ambitious and ruthless Shapur I. This wasn't just another border skirmish. The Sassanids had burned cities, captured fortresses. They wanted to break Rome's back in the east. Valerian met them head-on with a massive army, and then the unthinkable happened. His army was crushed at the Battle of Edessa. His legions, starved, diseased, overwhelmed, were surrounded. There was no escape. And Valerian, Emperor of Rome, commander of legions, master of the West, made a desperate gamble. He asked Shapur for peace terms. He offered to meet personally, a civilized negotiation between emperors. But Shapur didn't believe in civilization. He believed in humiliation. The moment Valerian entered his tent, he was seized, shackled, and paraded across Persia like a trophy. A Roman emperor in chains. It was a global shock. Rome, once untouchable, had now been disgraced. And Shapur. He wanted the world to never forget. So he didn't just imprison Valerian. He made him a footstool. Yes, literally. For years, whenever Shapur mounted his horse, he stepped on Valerian's back. An emperor, once draped in purple, reduced to a stepstool in the dirt. And if that weren't enough, Persian artists carved it into stone. A massive rock relief in Nakshi Rustam still stands today. It shows Shapur towering above, and beneath him, a bowed Roman. That image, etched in rock, visible for millennia, is a monument not to victory, but to utter humiliation. Some say Valerian was eventually killed, forced to swallow molten gold, his body flayed and stuffed with straw. His stuffed skin was allegedly displayed as a trophy in Persian temples, like a grotesque puppet of fallen power. Was it true? Historians debate. But what they don't debate is this. Valerian died far from Rome, a prisoner of his enemy, with no sword in his hand, no honor left in his bones, and no funeral worth the name. The emperor who once ruled an empire of 50 million people was reduced to an object beneath another man's boot. And the irony? The Romans never got him back. They never avenged him. He just vanished, a ghost emperor devoured by the East. Back in Rome, the news was a scandal. His son Gallienus tried to pretend it wasn't happening. Official proclamations ignored the truth. Coins were still minted in Valerian's name, as if the lie could protect the empire. But it didn't. Valerian's capture shattered the illusion of Rome's invincibility. If an emperor could be chained, anyone could. His story became a cautionary tale of hubris, of miscalculation, of what happens when an empire pushes too far into the fire and forgets that other men know how to burn too. Shapur didn't just win a battle. He won a message, a symbol, and Valerian became that message, forever immortalized, not as a warrior, or builder or philosopher king, but as a rug beneath an enemy's foot. It's easy to romanticize empire, to speak of glory and conquest. But in Valerian's end, we see the truth. Even gods can fall, even emperors can beg, and sometimes, history isn't written in gold but in ash and leather straps. We've reached the end, not just of this story, but of their stories. Kings, queens, warriors, philosophers, engineers, rebels, and fools. They came from palaces and prisons, deserts and temples, bridges and battlefields. And they all met the same thing, the end, but not quietly. Their deaths, some glorious, some gruesome, some downright ridiculous, are more than just footnotes. They are final acts. Curtains falling not with a whisper but with fire, laughter, betrayal, and poetry. So now we ask, what makes a death epic? It's not just the violence, it's not the blood or spectacle. It's the meaning, or the lack of it. An epic death is one that echoes, that says something bigger than just a life ended here. It speaks of irony, of fate, of the way the universe writes punchlines better than any playwright. Take Mithridates VI, who spent his life building an immunity to poison, only to find it useless when he needed it most, or Sigurd the Mighty, who died not in battle, but from the tooth of a man he had already beheaded. Chrysippus, a Stoic who taught the value of emotional control, until a donkey eating figs made him laugh himself to death. George Plantagenet, the power-hungry noble who drowned in his favorite wine, as if fate itself were drunk. Archimedes, a mind that moved mountains, killed by a soldier for daring to draw one last circle in the sand. Spartacus, who refused to die small, whose death was never seen, but whose rebellion was felt across the centuries. And Valerian, emperor of Rome, who died beneath another man's foot, not in glory, but in grotesque symbolism. These deaths are epic not because they are noble or pure, but because they are human. They reveal our weaknesses. They mock our pride. They remind us that no matter how high you climb, no matter how many titles precede your name, the end waits for everyone. Patiently, silently, with a twisted sense of humor. But here's the secret. Death doesn't always destroy legacies. Sometimes, it creates them. Would we remember Diogenes if he died peacefully in bed? Would Caligula's madness seem so theatrical without his bloody hallway exit? Would Rasputin be half as famous if he'd gone down after one bullet instead of multiple deaths in one? Sometimes the final moment becomes the definition, because when we talk about people, we often remember how they left us. And the epic ones? They don't go gently. They trip, crash, bleed, laugh, betray, explode, surrender, defy, but always, always, they say something about life, about time, about us. Because in the end, we don't tell these stories just to gawk or giggle. We tell them because we see ourselves in them. We are kings and rebels. We are thinkers and fools. We are terrified and brave and broken and brilliant, often at the same time. And when the curtain falls, we hope, not for immortality, but for memory, that someone, somewhere, will remember how we went out. So here's to the epic deaths, to those who left too loudly, to those who died too poetically, to those who didn't go quietly and didn't want to. May their stories live on, and may we, in our own small ways, make sure our lives, no matter how absurd or ordinary, end with something worth telling. Because the most epic deaths, they don't just end stories, they start legends,